Good morning. Welcome back for story time. Today we're going to be reading Magnus at the Fire by Jennifer Armstrong, illustrated by Owen Smith. Magnus had been a fire horse at the Broadway Firehouse in Hope Springs for 10 good years. For 10 years, he had plenty of oats, clean straw, and good water, and firemen always had a kind word or an apple for him. Beside him, in their own stalls, were his partners, Billy and Sparks. They were three big grays, strong as oxen and fast as the wind. Whenever the bells set out clanging from the top of the firehouse, Magnus, Billy, and Sparks sprang into action. An automatic switch opened the gate in front of their stalls and dropped the harness onto their backs. As soon as each horse felt it thump into place, he stepped forward into his yoke, and one of the firemen buckled it up. In 30 seconds, Magnus and his partners were ready to roll, and together they raced with the heavy steam pumper to the fire. Everyone stood back in awe as the three mighty fire horses galloped along. Pegasus himself couldn't beat those grays, folks always said. Look at them fly. No matter how hot or wild the fire was, or how many people were yelling and screaming, or how many dogs were barking, Magnus was never afraid. Being a fire horse was his whole life. He had even gone to the horse college outside of Germansville, so he knew how to handle himself around calamity and chaos. He stood rock steady while the firemen put out the fire. Then he pulled the pumper back to the Broadway Firehouse and had a rub down and an extra measure of oats. Being a fire horse was a hard job, but it had its rewards. Little children wandered into the firehouse every day, just to give Magnus sugar lumps, and dug their elbows into each other's sides as they said, "That's a mighty swell fire horse. He's a real live hero." One day, as Magnus was having a good scratch against the side of his stall, there was a commotion in the yard. Magnus switched his ears forward, waiting for the alarm bell. But the bell didn't ring. Instead, Captain French drove up to the station in a burping, belching, oil-smelling, newfangled contraption. "Boys, meet our brand new motorized fire engine," Captain French said proudly. "Holy smoke, she's a beaut, Captain," said Perillo. "I bet she'll do 30-40 miles an hour," said Johnson, patting the truck's hood. "We're the first smoke eaters in town to have one, boys," Captain French said. "Welcome to the modern age." The firemen pulled the old steam pumper out of the way and left it in the yard so the captain could back the new fire engine inside. Magnus and Sparks and Billy stretched their necks out and sniffed the new machine. "Well there, fellows," Captain French said to the horses. "I bet you don't know what this means. Perillo, Johnson, time to put the horses out to pasture." So the horses were put up for sale, just like that. The next day, Billy left to work at the dairy delivering milk and butter. For a week, Magnus and Sparks took a great deal of pleasure and enjoyment from the little bit of pasture behind the firehouse, where he and Sparks could roll in the grass to scratch their backs any old time they wanted, and they could bask in the sun with their eyes shut, whisking flies with their tails. But the next time the bell began to peal from the firehouse roof, Magnus dashed to the gate, waiting for the drop of the automatic harness onto his back. He sniffed the air for smoke and trembled with anticipation. While Magnus stood by the gate, the new fire truck rumbled out of the firehouse with its bell banging away, and the firemen drove off without him. Magnus waited and waited to go to the fire and do his job, just the way he had done it for 10 years. Later, when the truck came rumbling back, Magnus smelled the smoke on the firemen's clothes. They had been to a fire without him. He stayed there for a while longer, smelling the smoke, and then finally wandered back into the pasture. The next time the fire bell began clanging from the roof, Magnus didn't wait to be left behind. No, sir. The big old horse backed up for a running start, and then sprang clear over the fence. He followed the smell of smoke, galloping down Long Alley and over another 2 fences, his mane and tail flaring out behind him like flames until he reached the fire at the Oyster House on Congress Street. He was standing there, breathing hard, when the fire truck arrived. "What in blazes is Magnus doing here?" Captain French demanded. Of course, Magnus couldn't help getting in the way, and he didn't quite know what to do without the pumper to pull. Once the fire was dead, Perillo led Magnus back to the firehouse and put him in the pasture with Sparks. The next day a carpenter came to make the pasture fence higher. Magnus and the firemen were watching him when Zeke Fancher, the old captain, came by the firehouse for a visit. He lived on his son's apple farm now, and he missed the excitement and romance of being a smoke eater. "Guess what old Magnus did yesterday," Perillo said. "Jumped the fence and beat us to the fire, crazy horse." "You don't say," asked Fancher. He patted Magnus on the neck and gave him an apple. "I know how you feel, old-timer," he whispered in the big horse's ear. It wasn't too many days later that Magnus answered the call again. Of course, he had to bust down part of the new fence to do it, but when the fire truck arrived at the fire, sure enough, Magnus was already there. "You darn stubborn horse," Captain French hollered. "We don't need you anymore. Somebody tell Magnus to get out of the way. We're trying to fight a fire here." Magnus and the firemen hadn't been back at the Broadway firehouse more than 5 hours when there was another alarm. The bell clanged. Perillo gunned the truck and the firemen tore out of the house, horns blasting. Even as they barreled down the street, they saw Magnus sail over the fence and come charging behind them. "We've got to do something about that horse," French shouted. "He's getting to be a real troublemaker. Why won't he just stay retired and keep out of the way?" Thick smoke was pouring out of the windows of the United States Hotel. The firemen could see it as the truck barreled down Broadway. But just as they passed Gilbert's barber shop, there was a sound like a cannon shot. The truck skidded and swerved to a stop, and black smoke belched out from under the hood. Captain French threw his helmet on the ground. "Blew the motor, darn machine!" "We're not close enough," Perillo warned. "We've got to get closer." The firemen poured out of the truck and tried to push it up the street, but the new motorized engine was so heavy that they couldn't budge it more than an inch. Men from the barbershop and nearby hotels dashed out to help push, but there wasn't enough room for everyone to get a handhold. They just couldn't do it. The fire was growing wilder every second. Smoke and sparks swirled up in the hot air, and folks were stumbling out of the hotel, coughing and choking and wailing for help. "It's no use," Captain French bellowed. "Go get Magnus." Johnson ran up the street to the burning hotel, and sure enough, there was Magnus watching the fire. "Come on, fella, step lively." Johnson grabbed the big horse's halter and ran him back down Broadway to the busted fire truck. Perillo and Stevens rigged up a harness for Magnus with a hose. "Go, Magnus," Perillo said, with a smack on the horse's rump. Magnus felt the tug of weight behind him, and when he lunged forward, the truck was pretty heavy, and he didn't have Sparks and Billy to help him pull it, but he dug in with his big hooves, fighting for a foothold. The firemen wrestled with the engine from behind, and bystanders waved their hats, hollering, "Pull, Magnus, pull!" Inch by inch, the truck began to roll forward and picked up speed. "Pull, Magnus, you can do it!" Magnus strained with all his might, bending his neck to the job, dragging the truck toward the fire. One hoof slipped on some mud, but he just dug in even harder. "A little more, a few more yards. Push, smoke eaters, push!" the captain yelled over the roar of the flames. "Don't make Magnus do all the work." At last the truck was close to the burning hotel. The firemen grabbed the hoses and started to pump, while a waiter from the hotel led Magnus out of the way. "Good horse," the waiter said as they watched the firemen work. "Good horse." Firemen rushed in with hoses and axes. The crowd gasped and cringed as the smoke and steam billowed out of the hotel windows and singed pansies in the window boxes. But at last, after a fierce fight, Captain French's crew doused the blaze. Exhausted and covered with soot, the firemen and Magnus walked back to the firehouse. "Good horse," Johnson said as he rubbed Magnus down. "Brave horse." The next day, old Captain Fancher came to the Broadway firehouse and led Magnus back home with him. "We're going somewhere you won't hear the bell, old smoke eater. You don't have to answer it anymore. You've earned your rest." So from then on, Magnus spent his days eating apples and pulling Fancher's grandkids around the orchard in a wagon, and they had grand times when they held autumn bonfires behind the barn. Sometimes the old captain's daughter-in-law rang a bell to call the children into supper. And pretty soon Magnus learned that the sound of the bell meant one last hug from all the kids before they ran inside, where the fire in the stove was nice and warm. The end. Thanks for joining us for Storytime, and if you'd like to see some of our horse-drawn or motorized fire apparatus, you can come visit the Fire Museum when we're open. Bye.